In 2008, a movie by the name God on Trial was released. The setting of the movie was a death camp during World War II where a group of Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz decided to pass judgment on God for abandoning them to the Nazis and allowing the Holocaust to happen. It is interesting, certainly not surprising, how we tend to blame God for the sins of man. Of course, to blame God, one has to first posit the existence of God. If the rules of the American judiciary were to be used in the debate of God's existence, which side would win? Today you'll hear from a professor of law at Texas A&M University, Dr. Michael Conklin, who wrote an article on this very subject. With Dr. Michael Conklin, God on Trial, today on Resonant Truth. Michael, we want to talk about your article today, God on Trial, Applying Modern Legal Standards to Assess Arguments for and Against the Existence of God. I found the article very, very interesting. I looked at a number of your articles beyond just that one that you've got you've published, and I am a big fan of your writing style. I love someone that can write well while also applying academic standards to it. So it was easy to become a fan of your work, Michael. We want to talk about that a little bit. I'm curious your passion on this particular topic, because you're really meshing two areas of your history, your academic history, as well as your personal history. Why do Christians need to understand the rules of evidence in order to better understand the God debate?
Yeah, well, the rules of evidence and the courtroom, procedures for cross-examination and a lot of other things, they were designed and evolved over the years to be the best at getting to the truth. If you're on trial or, you're suing somebody else or somebody's suing you, you want to have the best procedures in place for, discovery and what kind of evidence can you do? What are you allowed to tell the jury and not tell the jury? So because this is just such a powerful standard for getting at the truth, it's perfect for answering other questions as well. So why not, the biggest, truth question I think of all time of does God exist? And furthermore, for people in law, whether it's practitioners or academics or law students, I think a lot of even Christians in that position have never really kind of made that connection, or atheists. And so by kind of presenting it to them that way, they can think, oh, well, okay, let's look at this. So yeah, if I maybe an atheist would say, yeah, if I honestly apply these standards that I use every day in the courtroom or that I'm learning at in law school, how would that go about? So it gets them to apply it in kind of a more neutral manner, because lawyers are very good about, they're zealous advocates for their client. So when they go to a trial, when they're on trial, they're not going to say, oh, you've got some really good points against my client. Yeah, it looks really bad for him. They're not going to say that. But in their minds, they think about it. It's very important in trial preparation to think about the weaknesses of your own case.
All
So
right.
they can be pretty honest with themselves about that. And I think at least that an honest assessment of the evidence on both sides leads to a very emphatic victory for the side that's presenting the evidence for God. So I'm hoping that by getting people to think about it in that way, it first it strengthens the faith of existing Christians, and then people, atheists, it gets them to at least think, wow, there is actually strong reason. Maybe they don't believe, but they at least think, wow, I used to think, people who believed in God were stupid, but wow, there's actually a lot to it. Even if they don't become Christians or become believers in a God, they at least think, oh, maybe I need to think about this. There's some strong evidence I've never heard of before.
There's so many parallels between, with the analogy that you're using. And I'm curious, um, where do you tend to see attorneys fail? Not necessarily. There's argument. There's the collection of facts, and then there's argumentation, the art of presenting those facts in a compelling way. Because you've got a variable that you can't control in that scenario, and that's the jury. They're coming with their presuppositions and their personal perspectives, and you've got 12 of them in a normal situation that you've got to be convincing with. Where do you tend to see that Christians fail from this perspective? You and I both have seen a number of YouTube apologists that aren't particularly good at it. You and I both have a history of exposure to some of the absolute bests of theologians and debaters in this space. So we know what good looks like. But I'm curious, where do you see, is there a parallel between where you see, probably young attorneys really tend to fail in this particular space, and how that, correlates over to Christians, probably non-professional apologists, where they tend to fail in the process of argumentation as well?
Yeah, I think the analogy works well in this way too, because trial attorneys, there's a lot of these in law school, there's advocacy programs, and then there's these like week-long camps that people will go to, practicing lawyers will go to become a better, litigator, a better courtroom attorney. And a lot of times what they say is it's not really the evidence. It's more of, you have to kind of get them emotionally. You got to get the jury to like you, get them emotionally on your side. You got to say a narrative. Everything's got to be a narrative. You got to tell stories. People love to hear stories and be entertaining. And I think, a lot of times as lawyers, we think very analytical. So we say, okay, well, here's the elements of the case. Here's my burden of proof. So I'm just going to hammer the facts. Like, look, here's this document. Here's this video footage. Here's this. So clearly we win. And instead of stringing together a powerful, entertaining, captivating narrative, being winsome and likable. There's been some interesting studies about that are actually kind of scary when a attorney in a mock trial is not likable, how fast the jury turns on him. That should be irrelevant. The jury is supposed to just look at the evidence. But yeah, if they like the attorney, they're far more likely to win. There's even been some interesting studies about when the defendant is visibly pregnant, they get a much lesser sentence. They're much more generous to them. So yeah, it can be a lot more subjective than people believe. So on the other side with Christians, I think a lot of times we look at this too analytically. It's like, okay, if I memorize this argument, okay, so I watched William Lane Craig say it, I memorized it. Okay, so now I told this atheist, and I know I got it right. I memorized it word for word, and they didn't they didn't abandon atheism right then and there. Like, well, why? That's how arguments work, right? It's like, no, that's not how arguments work. William Lane Craig talks about the point of an argument is to be so strong as to make the cost of denying it so high that the person it kind of makes them, they can do it. I've seen them do it, but it makes them subconsciously kind of feel intellectually dishonest that they had to do that.
Watchword, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, is really just an excuse for an a priori rejection of the miraculous, because you weren't, or you didn't give any sort of evidence that would satisfy you with respect to one of these extraordinary claims. It made it sound like, to me, you were saying that nothing would convince you, no matter what.
No, all sorts of things would convince me.
Well, with respect to the resurrection, though, I mean, you even said if there was a video camera, you'd say it was a fake stone that was rolled away. I mean, what sort of...
That would be the more reasonable hypothesis under the circumstances.
Well, but see, that's what I fear. It is. It's just an a priori rejection of the miraculous here. You're not. There isn't any kind of literary testimony, historical testimony that could convince you.
Once again, it's common sense. Let me appeal to court cases, okay? In court, on what basis do we believe certain testimony, okay? Well, we believe testimony often on the basis of how likely or unlikely we think it is that somebody is telling the truth, on the basis of all sorts of surrounding circumstances. Now, in court case, generally speaking, there are no claims to supernatural action. There are no claims to anything occurring which was physically impossible or against the laws of nature, however one wants to phrase it, that sort of thing. Yet we still judge guilt or innocence, send people to the to execution or not, on the basis of what we consider to be likely or unlikely on the given circumstances, that sort of thing. So once again, these extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In no way implies a bias against the supernatural. It's simply an application of a rule which we use in our daily lives.
But you're saying that when you say extraordinary, really what you're saying is no amount of evidence would convince me of these extraordinary claims.
Sure it would. If tomorrow morning, immediately after breakfast, suddenly there was an earthquake, and a silvery light shone in the sky, and the leaves dropped from the trees, and I dashed outside, and there, towering over us like 100 Everests, was this giant figure with lightning playing around his Michelangeloid face, and he pointed down and saying, "Be assured, Keith M. Parsons, that I do in fact exist, and I'm sick of your logic chopping." Dr. Craig, I would join you in the pew of the church, in the front pew of the church the next Sunday.
Be going to the question and answer period. We're going to go to the question and answer period, so be going to the microphone as we wind this down.
You don't think that you would have said, "Boy, I was having a hallucination."
What's your perspective of debate in academia today? Now, America historically and academia historically has been an environment that not only encourages the debate, it expects you to earn your way toward competency by demonstrating your competency in debate. The founding fathers of our country, the debate was a critical aspect of us hammering out some of the tenets of our Constitution, Bill of Rights, and everything else that the country is built on. But we're in a different environment today, as you very well know, Michael. Postmodernists tend to shy away from debate because they have an anti-truth presupposition. Political leftists shy away from debate because, as we've seen historically, certainly over the past 5 or 6 years, their arguments aren't very good, and they need to use different tactics like inculcation and indoctrination as their means of influence. So why do Christians in this environment of what I'll describe as an intellectually fragile, anti-debate culture of the 21st century Western society, why do we need to be better debaters? Because it seems to be not the thing that moves the bar in an environment and culture like we have today.
Well, I will say first, so of course I'm speaking in my individual capacity. I do think debate can be effective. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is a blanket anti-debate culture. I think a lot of times with social media, things that are fairly rare, like when you see people getting, well, I guess I can't say that's too rare when you see people get shouted down. I've seen a lot of examples of that. But academia is a broad realm. It includes the gender studies department and it includes the engineering department. And those are very different fields, right? So I'm kind of a little closer to the engineering department. I teach at a college of business and I teach at a law school. So it's a little more, if I start saying things and publishing things that are absurd, it's going to become obvious because, if you run your business like that, it's going to go bankrupt. If you argue like that in the courtroom, you're going to lose all your cases. But there's some fields, I'm not going to call them out by name, I guess, but there's some fields in academia where if you publish a bunch of absurd stuff, there's never any consequences. It never becomes evident that what you're saying is absurd.
Mm.
Engineering is kind of the extreme other example. If you teach your students the wrong way to build a bridge, all their bridges are going to collapse, and it's going to become very evident that you're wrong. You can mathematically prove that you're wrong. So it can be kind of broad, but in my experience, and I haven't taught at any of the ultra liberal schools, but in my experience, from faculty and from students, people are receptive to people who think differently than them. So again, I'm teaching in kind of the more conservative areas, the College of Business, and schools that are maybe a slightly more on the conservative side. So I haven't seen that too much. But regardless of the trend and how it is now versus 20, 40 years ago, still there's people who will listen. Maybe more of them won't, but there's still people who will. So regardless, we're called to try to reach those people. So I think debate is a great way, not for every single person, especially if somebody has more of an emotional reason for not believing in God. These debates might not be great for them, but there's a lot of people who mistakenly believe that atheists have the high ground when it comes to logic and reason, and nothing could be further from the truth. So I think for a lot of those types of people, hearing a debate and openly listening to the evidence for both sides. I've done public debates before, and I've had students come up, shocked, like, "Well, I didn't even think you should have done this debate as a Christian, but now that I see, like, wow, I didn't even know there's all these arguments." And gosh, I've had atheists come up to me and kind of reluctantly say, "Yeah, that you crushed that atheist, like he didn't have anything." And then I kind of say, well, that's not because he didn't try. I just have the better side. He could be a better debater than me. I don't know. But if you're taking a losing side, it's easy for the other side to come out ahead. So yeah, I think not for everybody, but for a lot of people, there's definitely a large niche for, debate and, logical arguments. Yeah. I think Christians are wrong when they think that's for everybody, every single person in every single situation.
Right.
If somebody just lost a loved one, and for that reason they think there's no God, and you come at them with the cosmological argument that might just be kind of like two, ships passing in the night. You're not going to do any good there, but I think it certainly has its place.
So let's expand on that a little bit. Michael, you've mentioned kind of as we've gotten to know each other a little bit, you've mentioned about a desire to begin a speaking or debate tour on college campuses. There are some signs of hope as we take a look at the culture today. Boy, there's a lot to be depressed about, but there are some sparkles of hope when you take a look at Gen Z. Specifically, they're showing more of evidence of a conservative drift, and I've got my own perspective on why this is, because there's a lot of evidentialism. As you're younger, you kind of need to see it for it to matter. That shifts a bit as you grow older, but we're seeing that the sales pitch, the empty sales pitch of the non-believer is not hitting home as much when it comes to Gen Z. And I'm curious if you're seeing evidence of that, and why you think that they may be a bit more fertile ground to reintroduce debate. Talk about that a little bit in your perspective of maybe Gen Z shows evidence of that being a fertile ground for this discipline to have a resurgence.
So with trends like that, I think it's important to see, even if it was going the other direction, I think it would still be fertile ground. So maybe it's 60-40 one way, but maybe 10 years from now, it'll be 60-40 the other way, but 40% is still a lot of people. So we can, I guess this should kind of energize us that maybe there's ebbs and flows, and maybe we're kind of on a flow now that our evangelizing can be even more effective at this exact moment. But if it ebbs in 10 years from now and it goes the other direction, it's just a slight change. It's not that everybody has not become receptive. So yeah, maybe now people are 10% more receptive, and maybe 10 years from now they'll be 10% less receptive, but we can still reach them. So I don't really follow the trends in that way as much, because yeah, I'm called to do this type of outreach either way, until it gets to the point where there's 0% people who are listening, which that'll never happen. So yeah, I just think that even I'm kind of targeting law schools. We all have our little niche that we're called to go reach, and I think that this is going to be the way that I present it, using courtroom rules of evidence and cross-examination as kind of an analogy. I think that'll be even more effective to people in law school.
Okay, so sometimes twins in the uterus, one twin absorbs the other. So when that twin that absorbed it is born, would you consider that twin, that child, that baby a murderer?
No, of course not. No, I mean no.
But that baby technically killed its
No, it
sibling.
didn't. What you're talking about, it happens the first couple days of human development, where the two zygotes one might absorb the other. It's not taking out an axe and slitting the throat of the other.
But I still don't believe that abortion is murder.
Okay, did the twin use human agency to eliminate another human life?
No.
Then it's not murder. But therefore, during abortion, one human being uses human agency to kill its young. Can you point to another mammal, another part of the animal kingdom, that goes out of its way to kill its young just because their life might be hard?
No, but I still believe that abortion should be legal.
When does human life begin?
I would say when it's born.
Okay, so how does so when it's born. So therefore, if a pregnant woman was walking here on campus and she was murdered, the person who murdered that pregnant woman, should they be guilty of a single homicide or a double homicide? Let her answer the question.
I do believe double if that woman wanted to keep that baby and have that baby.
But hold on, just help me understand this. How can life be so, just loosely defined that it's all on the intent on the mom, whether or not that's a human? So your human distinction is wholly dependent on whether or not a mom wants to keep you?
It depends on how the mother feels about her baby, yes. If she doesn't want it, then she should have the right to have an abortion.
No, but we're talking about something different. Is it not objectively a human life if that pregnant mom is all of a sudden a victim of a homicide?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, but then if it's objectively a human life when it's a homicide, how is it not objectively a human life when that is in an abortion clinic?
Because it's not what the mother wanted. She doesn't want to have that kid.
Do you have a right to murder another human being?
No, but abortion isn't murder.
Okay, but then fine. Define murder.
The taking of another life.
Let her finish, for God's sakes, please.
It's taking another life, in the world. Once the baby's out, that's when it counts as murder. If you killed a baby, that's murder. But killing a fetus isn't murder.
What species is the fetus?
Human.
Then how is it not murder?
Because it hasn't been born yet.
Why does that make it human?
Because that's when, it's not dependent on the mom, and it can be, its own thing.
You want the mom to be able to have choice over her body?
Yes.
Got it. So, does the baby have any, does the baby's body matter?
To me, no.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, since you are, resolutely, in favor of choice, do you think it should be legal or allowed if a mom wants to have an abortion if the kid has Down syndrome?
Okay, I think that mothers should have the choice to have an abortion no matter what the reason is. But if the reason is they have Down syndrome or they're going to be autistic, then that woman shouldn't have been a mother in the first place. Because
if a mom is pregnant and she finds out she's having a girl and she wants a boy. Is that an okay reason to have an abortion? To abort a girl because you want a boy?
I wouldn't say it's an okay reason.
Should it be legal?
But she can't, yes.
Michael, before we get into some of the tactical elements of your paper, which I thought was fascinating, who, from your perspective, who's the best example of this? And it's not fair, since both you and I have a really strong connection to William Lane Craig. Even atheists consider him to be the best. So I'll pull the rug out just a little bit on that one. But aside from that, in all seriousness, who do you think is, this person gets it? Not just from a standpoint of the discipline of debate, but speaking of Dr. Craig, he's really big on making sure, even if his interlocutor is not doing their side of the job in the debate, by keeping the audience enthralled with the story and keeping track of the debate, he'll make sure he does that for you. Who's an example today that you say, that's what I want to teach my students, my law students, to be able to do it that way? Can you give me some examples?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good ones, but yeah, I mean, you couldn't go wrong with William Lane Craig. If somebody was said, "Hey, I want to see some of these debates that you're talking about," yeah, go to YouTube, type in William Lane Craig debate. You probably get some really good ones. Yeah, and I think especially because he doesn't. I mean, he's phenomenal when he goes up against an atheist who is being intellectually honest and actually addressing the arguments. He does very good against them, but he also does good when he goes up against an atheist who is kind of not taking it seriously and just trying to kind of make appeals to emotion and not really kind of intentionally not understanding William Lane Craig's arguments. I think he does the best you can do against those people too. He stays on point. He doesn't let them drag him off into some other realm that doesn't have anything to do with the debate. He never gets, sometimes people will kind of make kind of ad hominem attacks on him and his belief, and he kind of, well, that's irrelevant, and back to the point, back to the point. You know, as far as effective, that's interesting because, it's hard to say, what's the most effective as far as converting people. There may be someone else out there who is similar to William Lane Craig as far as like debate ability and grasp of the arguments and all the counter arguments, but maybe is even more, I don't know, for young people, like maybe more exciting, maybe more hip, and can kind of use interesting analogies that might be more effective with like a high school crowd. I don't know exactly who that would be off the top of my head, but yeah, there may be somebody who's kind of more relatable and communicates even better with teenagers than William Lane Craig, but still has that really rock solid apologetics behind him. But yeah, overall, I mean, you just can't go. There's a reason that he was kind of the default answer for both of us. I mean, he's really, really good. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a Catholic apologist. I'm not Catholic, I'm Protestant, but there's a Catholic apologist that I absolutely enjoy. Trent Horn is, from my perspective, a rock star of apologetics debate. Don't agree with all of his conclusions and everything, but he's somebody that does it real well. I actually saw a podcast the other day between him interviewing and William Lane Craig, and there's a lot of mutual respect there. So there's a lot of good examples of the best of apologetics and debate in general today. In your article, you get into the arguments for and against God, and I really appreciated, Michael, how you really dive into the arguments against, and you apply the same litmus test of credibility and truth to the arguments against God as you do the arguments for God. Before we get into kind of your perspective of some of the points that you wanted to make in the article, what's your favorite argument for, and what do you think is the most, I'll use the word compelling, I guess, argument against God that you think offers more of a challenge to either the professional or the non-professional Christian apologists?
See, there's a lot to unpack there. So I'll start with that last question. I like the question of asking believers, like, well, what's the strongest atheist argument? Because I found it very effective to ask an atheist, not in a public debate, but just in a casual conversation, ask an atheist, it's a very genuine question, well, I'm very honest, I've studied a lot of these arguments. So as an atheist, when you've looked at the arguments for God, which one did you find the most compelling? And they say, well, none of them. I say, well, obviously none of them converted you, but which one was the least bad? You think they're all bad, but which one was the least bad? 9 times out of 10, when I do that, their answer is, well, I don't know. I guess I don't know any. And so then they ask you, well, what are they? So then you've got them asking you. They want to hear the arguments for God's, and then you get to tell them, well, here's the arguments. So I found that very effective because it kind of subconsciously kind of shames them, like, how could you possibly, I don't say this out loud, but it's kind of implied, well, how could you be an atheist of this huge question and you haven't even sought out a single argument for the existence of God? Like, it seems like you haven't really thought about this much. And I think they do kind of feel a little bit of like, oh wow, I guess I haven't really thought of this. I need to hear these arguments. So I find that very effective. Okay, so I would say probably, I'm gonna give 2 answers. Probably the most effective argument for atheism is probably the worst, logical argument for atheism. It's just, well, bad things happen, there's existence of evil, there's pain and suffering, so therefore God doesn't exist. I think logically it's just a horrible, horrible argument. But I do think for a lot of people that's very effective. I think even for there's a lot of people who claim at least that they lost their faith because something bad happened to them. For a similar reason for me, I don't understand that, because logically, when I became a Christian, I didn't think I was signing up for all of my relatives to become immortal and nothing to ever bad happen to me. But so I think that is very effective, that bad things happen to people, and for whatever reason that I don't understand, for me it brings me closer to God. But for whatever reason, people say, there must not be a God, something really bad happened to me. So I think that's probably the strongest as far as result oriented. But as far as like thinking about it logically, the strongest argument for atheism, I would probably say, is some form of, if God exists, surely he would make himself more obvious. The more obvious he made himself, the less we would be able to have faith in him. It's kind of the difference. If your spouse comes home and said, oh, I had to work late at work, that's where I was at, you could trust her, or you could, demand evidence and get some sworn statements that she was actually at work. Well, which one of those is a healthier relationship? But I say logically, that's probably the best argument for atheism. I think when you look at the counter arguments to it, it's not that strong. But I think it's the best out of the worst arguments. As far as the ones that I present, personally, I think the argument from design is pretty strong, but I didn't use that in the paper because it can really get bogged down a lot. An atheist who really knows a lot about the subject can really drag you into deep water on that topic. And if you don't really know the area, it can make you look bad. So I just focused on 2 arguments, which I, in the paper, argue are more than enough to counter all of the arguments that atheists may present. And that was the moral argument and some form of the cosmological argument.
We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
I think especially with a cosmological argument, the biggest problem is a lot of times it gets, William Lane Craig will present it, and the atheist, and I've had this happen to me too, the atheist will say, well, okay, the premise that the universe began to exist, yes, that's the overwhelming scientific consensus now. Pretty much all the evidence available now does point to a beginning of the universe, but maybe in the future, maybe we'll discover some new groundbreaking discovery, and maybe we'll discover the universe isn't eternal, or it is eternal and it didn't have a beginning. Well, that's not how it works. You go based on the evidence that you have. When that future day comes, then we'll look at that evidence. But yeah, in a courtroom, you can't say, yeah, all the evidence is against my defendant, but yeah, maybe in the future some new evidence will come up. No, you go to the trial with the evidence that you have. So I think the courtroom analogy really helps to illustrate to people the burden is not on the theist to show that there is no possible way that this argument couldn't possibly not work. It's just to show that it's more likely than not. And it's clearly at this point, with the evidence we have, more likely than not that the universe had a beginning. It's very, very way more than just 50%. And that's all that's necessary. So I think that analogy really helps, especially people in the law, kind of understand, oh yeah, like that would be an unreasonable burden to put on him to show that there is not some possible future thing that might happen that we don't know about now. I mean, you could use that to refute anything if that was the standard. So I think that burden of proof and demonstrating we only have to demonstrate things as more likely than not, similar to in a courtroom civil case, really helps bring that home. Yeah.
Let's talk further about that courtroom dynamic, Michael. In your paper, you spend time discussing the prospect of laying the groundwork. This is kind of the trial equivalent of an opening statement to the jury, and you kind of talk about this. There were a couple of points that you were highlighting, and I'm curious, as you approach teaching your students about approaching the jury, in this particular case is a collective. Out of 12 people, there's going to be some people that just simply presuppositionally are against what you're bringing to the table. And I'm curious how you teach them to deal with that dynamic. Some it's going to be fertile ground, and some it's going to be rocky soil.
Yeah, there is a joke that when when you're a criminal defendant and you ask for a jury trial, you're putting your hands you're putting your fate in the hands of people that were too dumb to get out of jury duty. It's kind of just a little joke there. And I know a lot of famous trial attorneys, after the trial is over, you're allowed to go talk to the jury. If they want to talk to you, you're allowed to ask them about things. So a lot of them will go, even if they win, they'll go and talk to the jury, just kind of hone their skills and become better attorneys. So they'll ask them, well, why did you voted for me and my side won. Why did you do that? And they'll say a lot of the times the jury will say, oh, well, I really liked this point. And they never even made that point. But yeah, in a jury, there's this issue of, well, okay, I've got this guy on the jury. He's a medical doctor, so he can understand. But this person on the jury doesn't even have a high school education and looks like he's not even paying attention. So yeah, how do you kind of try to go in the middle to reach both of them? So there's a lot of issues there. It's really important to know who your audience is. So when I do a public debate, I'm not really trying to change the mind of the atheist that I'm debating. That's probably not going to happen. That'd be great if it did. But I'm really just, my audience is the audience. I'm trying to change their mind. So I'm trying to just kind of, demonstrate the strength of my position and the other side's inability to make a strong case. And then I always try to kind of emphasize, I don't want the audience to think, Well, the only reason that Christian won the debate was because the atheist clearly wasn't prepared. He didn't have any good counter arguments, and he didn't have any positive arguments for his own side. So I kind of try to say something toward the end of, that's not the case. I mean, he could have, they're not out there. There's not great, strong arguments for atheism that really win the day.
Peter is right very often in his critique of superstition, of mythology and nonsense. And science has helped to clear away some of the nonsensical things that sometimes religious people profess. But what really makes me, in one sense, very much in favor of the Christian faith is that from the very start it claims to be evidence-based. And the central piece of evidence is, of course, as you probably know, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I believe in Peter's methodology. I use it all the time. But somehow he feels that a Christian like me doesn't use that methodology within my own Christian faith. Final point, I think explanation. Can science explain everything? We need to tease out what we mean by the word explanation. For example, the law of gravity doesn't explain gravity. It tells, as Newton realized, it tells us wonderful mathematics that we can calculate the way in which heavy bodies move in relationship to one another. But even when we say science explains, often it doesn't explain comprehensively. And I just want to throw a very simple analogy into this, which I find quite useful. About boiling water. How would you explain boiling water? Well, you can explain it by talking about heat conduction and agitation of molecules of water. You can also say the water is boiling because I'd like a cup of tea. Now, those two explanations are very different. They don't conflict. They complement. One is a scientific explanation, natural scientific, but the other is an explanation in terms of the intention and purposes of an agent. And Peter said quite clearly that science doesn't go in for that kind of purpose, but that doesn't mean that kind of purpose doesn't exist. In fact, people have been enjoying tea for millennia before they knew anything about the theory of heat in physics. So what I want to say is this. The God explanation is different from the science explanation. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with physics as an explanation of the motor car.
Okay, thank you. Great introductory statements from both of you. I'm sure there's lots you want to respond to there. Peter, where do you want to begin?
Well, there's so much nonsense to hack away from.
This may be the phrase of the evening, yes.
Yeah. Let's go to what you called the core of your approach, which is the resurrection of Jesus. Never happened. I mean...
Well, that's an assertion, Peter. What about some evidence?
Well, what about some evidence that it did happen, other than people who are writing Gospels of 80 years later than the event that they purport to be talking about? No, of course it didn't happen. How could it happen? And science, I think, could even go so far as saying it simply could not happen. When you've got a dead body, it's decaying straight away. There's no way that it's going to reconstitute in some way. It's absurd. And I accept that it is the foundation of Christian faith. That doesn't mean to say that it's true. And so let's dismiss that as something that simply has no evidence whatsoever of any credible
Before we
nature.
dismiss it, let's hear a response from John, because obviously this is an important issue. What counts as evidence and what are the assumptions
and indeed,
we make?
I suppose you would argue that science cannot explain the resurrection.
Well,
I wouldn't quite argue that way. I would say that science cannot forbid a resurrection, because you see, science proceeds on discovering the regularities to which nature works and has done a very impressive job. And the fact that we know that dead bodies don't normally rise that is a law of nature in that sense, means that we recognize something very special happened, if it did happen. Now, there are two issues here. First of all, there's the in-principle one, which always ends up in talking about David Hume, who said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And I do not believe they are. That's point number one, and I can go into that if you like. Do you want me to?
Do you want to believe? Well, we might as well, since you raised it.
Well, you've got to define a miracle. I think a miracle is defined as something that is against the laws of nature.
But I don't define it like that at all. A miracle, miraculum in Latin simply means something to be wondered at, but we're talking about something supernatural. Now, it seems to me very clear that when Hume said miracles violate the laws of nature, he was really not understanding. And the great interpreter, Anthony Flew, of David Hume.
No.
Sorry?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think he was going to object to the raising of Anthony Flew.
Oh, well, I'll not raise Anthony Flew.
Let's get back to raising
He
Jesus.
has died and hasn't risen. I do, I do see that point. But the point is this. C.S. Lewis long ago told a little analogy. If I stay in a hotel tonight, put £100 in a drawer, and do the same tomorrow night, there are £200 in it. 1 + 1 = 2. If on the third morning I find 50 quid, what do I say? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of England? Clearly, I say the laws of England have been broken. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. It's our recognizing of what normally happens that helps us to see an exception. Now, if I were claiming that the body of Jesus rose from the dead by processes, natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before we happened, yes, that would be wrong. But I'm not claiming that. What Christians claim is that the God that created the universe and built the regularities into it is capable...
Pure speculation.
Well, wait a minute. No, this is
not worth listening.
This isn't speculation.
Well, let's listen and then you respond, Peter.
Peter, it's dead easy to say it's not worth listening to. You tempt me to say that about some of the things you say, but I'm not going to do that. Because it seems to me it's very important to listen to what Christianity claims before you judge it. And what is claimed is the God who creates the universe and sustains it is not subject to laws as if they were laws of a land. He set up the regularities and he can feed a new event into them. And the claim is, and with this I finish, that God raised Christ from the dead by an input of colossal power.
Oh, Jesus.
Well, you've got it, Peter, in one.
No, I mean, this
that is the claim at the end of the day.
Yeah. But, I mean, this is, everyone knows here that's nonsense. What you're inventing is an agent who can do anything he likes, he or she likes, I suppose you have to say these days. And so it is the laziest way of accounting for observations, sometimes observations that were never actually made. Religious explanations which resort to God did it are intellectually lazy. I won't use a stronger term than that, but I do think that they are lazy because, I mean, what does it mean as an explanation? You lie there saying, oh, God did it, and everyone says, oh, I understand now. Religious explanations are easy to accept by the unthinking. Science is difficult to accept because it involves a lot of thought. You really have to tease out the processes by which an event occurs. You can't simply say, and God did it. You've got to go through, in biology, you delve down into, if you like, the chemistry of the organism. In chemistry, you delve down into the physics of the underlying processes. And I accept maybe in physics, you have to delve down into the underlying mathematical fabric of whatever I mean by that. It's jolly hard work. And you've got to work on it. But it's more satisfying when you get to the end of an explanation than that extraordinarily lazy way of pretending to explain by saying, and abracadabra, God did it. I mean, that is intellectually corrupt.
Okay.
But Peter, that's confusing two different kinds of explanations.
Yes, indeed.
If you were to say about a motor car, Henry Ford did it, and that's all you had to say, then I would agree with you. But the point is, as I sit here and read your books and explaining chemistry and all this kind of thing, I say, this is wonderful. This is not contradicting the God explanation, because the God explanation is saying that you, as a chemist, only have a universe to study because God created it in the first place. But he's not competing. In fact, interestingly, and this has always been a bit of a mandate for me, the very early chapters of Genesis, God commands human beings to name the animals. He starts off taxonomy, which is the basic intellectual discipline. In other words, he said, you go and do science, and you'll find it utterly fascinating. So I think you're arguing at a straw God and not a straw man.
You don't know whether God was starting off science. He might have got so bored with his creation that he wanted to amuse them in some way.
Who's speculating now?
Yeah, I am.
Yes. Okay.
I think any speculation that uses the word God is intellectually corrupt.
I mean,
but this is absurd.
There is no God.
No,
be quiet. There is not one jot of evidence for God.
Oh, I think there's a
Only
lot
in
of
lazy
evidence
minds
for
is there
God.
evidence for God.
Okay, so let me just to summarise.
Yes,
lazy, corrupt, and any mention of God is simply going down that path. Why for you is that not the kind of lazy, corrupt explanations you're talking about?
First of all, take science itself. Why am I passionate about science? Why do I believe science can be done? Well, because I believe that in some way the human mind in here has access to the natural world out there. Now, why do I believe that? And sometimes I ask my atheist friends, I've never asked Peter this, but so he's excused, but I have asked many of them. I said, what do you do science with? And they say and they're about to say mind when they realize it's not politically correct to say mind. They say my brain. And I say, tell me about your brain. And one man who's rather famous, he said to me, do you want the really short answer? I said, sure. My brain's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. So I looked at him and smiled and said, and you trust it? And then I asked this question, which I've asked many times. Suppose you knew your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Would you trust it? And I've always had the answer, no. And then I say, I see you have a problem. In other words, your atheist materialist stance undermines my trust in the rationality I need to do science. Now, if you flip the coin, modern science exploded in the 16th and 17th centuries, and its pioneers, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, and so on, were all believers in God, most of them Christian. And the point is, it was their belief in God that didn't hinder their science. It was the motor that drove it. So for two reasons. One, the legitimizing of doing science at all is one of the reasons I believe in God. God as an explanation makes more sense. It has explanatory power. The atheist explanation, as even some atheists like Thomas Nagel these days are beginning to see, undermines confidence and rationality.
So in your paper, you talk about the dilution effect, and this is really you describe it as a cognitive bias type, and I think this is an area that also is an area to give advice to Christians. Talk about the dilution effect a little bit.
Yeah, it's a very interesting area of psychological research. You know, a lot of people going into a debate, they think it's like a point scoring system. And the more arguments you make, the more points you get. And so if you made 8 arguments and the other side made 6, well, you made 2 more, so you win. And that's not how it works. It's actually the opposite. So there's these studies where in mock trials, let's say one side has, 2 really strong arguments, and then they have 3 other arguments that are, they do support their position, but they're a lot weaker. Okay, so they'll do one study where they just present the 2 strongest arguments. Okay, so let's say out of 10, if we're scoring these arguments for how strong they are, those first 2 arguments are 9s. Okay, so presented 2 9s. So the people who hear that, they say, wow, their evidence averages a 9. That's really strong evidence. But then you take another group of people and you present them the 2 strong arguments that are 9s, and you present the 3 weak arguments that are maybe 2s or 3s. So they do strengthen the case, but they're weaker. What people do subconsciously is they average that out. Okay, so we got 2 9s and then we got 3 2s. Well, that averages out to, I don't know, a 4.5 or a 5 or something. So the first person is actually going to win their case more often, even though they presented less evidence. All 5 of those pieces of evidence make their case, more likely true than not. So if we were thinking perfectly logically, the second person should be more likely to win their case. But because of this cognitive bias, people think that first person has a stronger case because they're thinking, yeah, that evidence he presented, it was about a 9. It was so strong. And the second person, they kind of get lost in the arguments. I don't know, there was a lot of arguments. That one argument wasn't so strong. The other side had some decent rebuttals against that. So overall, I'd say, he had a 5, overall. So it can be a lot more effective to go with your strongest arguments and just 1 or 2 of them. So in my paper, when I use my kind of hypothetical court adjudication of does God exist, I just had 2 arguments. They're very strong arguments. I could have presented 8 other arguments, but I think that would have been less effective. I just did my 2. And then in my closing arguments, I say, each one of my arguments individually proves that God is more likely to exist than not. They were not refuted in any way. And the other side didn't present any strong arguments for their case. So therefore, we must logically conclude the verdict is that God does exist. That's very simple. If I presented 8 arguments, some things just get lost in the shuffle, and maybe my 8th strongest argument, the other side maybe would have had a decent counter argument to it. So then, it's just better to go with fewer arguments that are stronger.
Michael, Jesus's ministry was a personal ministry. Certainly there are stories of him talking to the crowds, but whenever miracles occurred or anything significant from that perspective that was completely remarkable about the story of Christ on earth, it was on a personal basis. There's another parallel that's implied with kind of your past couple of answers, and that is the ability to read the jury. It's really not a single entity, it's 12 individual people. And so I'm curious, is that just as a believer talking to a non-believer, you really need to understand that you're talking to a human being that has human experiences, and that's who you're talking to. That goes beyond the fundamentals of, as you've mentioned a couple of times now, checking the boxes of debate, but really connecting with an individual. This sounds more like an art than a science, but is there a dynamic of reading the jury that you teach in law school? And I'd like to hear some about that.
Yeah, of course, you're not really allowed to talk to the jury. You ask them questions in voir dire and jury selection process. You get to know them in that way, and you can even start to make your case kind of subtly in the jury selection process. So you kind of know about them through that. And in big cases, they'll fill out, 100 questionnaires. So you know all these things about them. But, it's not an interaction during the trial. You don't get to hear back from them about anything. But yeah, for a Christian apologist, having a one-on-one conversation with somebody, yeah, I've found a very effective question to ask is, what would you accept as evidence that you're wrong? Because then it allows the other side to just custom tell you, maybe it's more emotional based and they'll tell you that, or maybe it's more logic based, or they heard some argument somewhere on the internet that they thought was just a case closed argument for atheism, and they tell you that. And so, well, if somebody could refute this, I'd be open to it. Or maybe it's something real irrational. Oh, there's hypocrites in the church, so therefore God doesn't exist. You can address that. So just asking them that question, and a lot of times you get the answer. If you ask them, well, what would you accept as evidence that you're wrong? They'll say, well, nothing. You say, oh, okay, you can kind of shame them. Well, if you're not even willing to listen to any of the evidence, nothing would ever change your mind, then, your belief is just kind of more of a irrational hope and a wish than any evidence-based thing. So kind of just asking people to tell you, kind of be upfront with why they don't believe, I've found is a very effective tactic. Of course, you have to be prepared for them to ask you the exact same question. Yeah.
Michael, let's talk about the distinction of evidence versus proof. Certainly there is a legal distinction that I want you to talk about. And we spoke earlier about the fact that the Christian absolutely does have proof. It's personal proof and personal experience that absolutely is life-changing to us individually, but that in itself may not necessarily be, convincing as a basis of an argument for somebody else. I would argue that it's the most, as I mentioned earlier, the most genuine argument that you can have, but somebody's experience may be interpreted as purely subjective and not necessarily translate to somebody else. So this discussion of proof versus evidence, we use the language of evidence from a standpoint of Christian apologetics, but you use the word proof from a standpoint of the legal environment. How do you know, but even when that's used from a legal perspective, it's reasonable proof. How do you know that you're hitting one versus the other? I'm curious about that legal distinction and how you teach the litmus test for beyond a reasonable doubt and just good evidence that doesn't meet that highest mark. Talk about that just a bit.
So this is where I think the courtroom analogy really works, because there's a lot of atheists, I think sometimes effectively, if the person on the other side doesn't call them out for it, who can kind of win the day by setting this artificially high burden on the believer. Yep. So William Lane Craig presents the cosmological argument, and the other side says, well, maybe, here's this one study that says that maybe the universe didn't, begin to exist, and maybe it is eternal. And they think, well, I've won the day because I've shown that maybe there's a chance. I call that the Lloyd Christmas defense. If you remember from Dumb and Dumber, there was the scene where he asked the girl, do I have a chance with you? Or he said, well, what's my chance with you? And she said, oh, I mean, it's like 1 in a million. And he gets excited. Oh, so you're saying there's a chance? Well, that's not how we do logical things. If there's a 1 in a million chance of something, you don't say, well, let's just go with that. Then we'll pretend that that's what happened. So it kind of demonstrates that. So the criminal burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. So for my paper and for this hypothetical trial, we're using the civil court standard of preponderance of evidence. So it's just 51%. So if I'm suing you because I say you stole my car or something, or trashed my house or something, in civil court, I only need to demonstrate to the jury that it's 51% likely that you did that. You caused those injuries that I'm now seeking compensation for. So you could show that it's 49% probable that you did not cause those harm, and I still win. So it's only 51%. You only have to show it's 50, and I get to recoup 100% of my damages, even though I only showed it was 51% likely. So that's the standard. I mean, if something is more likely than not, if I can show that God is 51% likely, we wouldn't go around saying, okay, well, then we're going to believe the 49% that he doesn't exist. That wouldn't make any sense. Now, of course, I believe even with the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, I think in a trial, I think the evidence for God would still even reach that. But just to kind of make it a fair burden of proof where it's equal on both sides, if either side showed 51%, they'd win the day. I think then it's just overwhelming that the case for God would win. The verdict would be that it's more likely than not that God exists. I think that's kind of one of the biggest things in debates. Like I said, if the other side doesn't call out the atheist on it, I think they can trick a lot of people by rigging that burden of proof. I mean, there's been some debates where they even openly do that. I've seen atheists say, well, in order, he's claiming that God exists, and that's such just a huge claim. So he's got to be like 80%, I think this guy said. So if it's 75% likely that God does exist, then I, the atheist, still win the debate, which is just completely absurd. Right. Yeah, you just need to show that it's more likely than not to be the case.
Michael, where do you tend to see that Christians fail in apologetic debate? Does the depth of our faith tend to make us intellectually lazy as to the need for evidential support and rational defense of God, Jesus, and the gospel itself? What do you see where we tend to fail as we apply these principles of argumentation and debate to our faith?
Well, I'll see that when Christians are exposed to a debate, like a William Lane Craig debate, I think it really strengthens their faith. And I'd say the biggest mistake that Christians make when it comes to these types of things is not, I've seen a lot of debates where there's somebody makes a technical blunder, and that happens in various ways. But I think the biggest mistake is that a lot of Christians think that in order to have a discussion like this, they have to have all the answers. They have to be William Lane Craig. They have to have an advanced degree. They have to read all the books on the subject, watch all the debates, and be prepared for every possible counter argument that might pop up. And then they just, kind of analysis paralysis. They just refuse to do it because they're afraid maybe this person will have the one argument I'm not aware of, and I can't do that. I won't have an answer back for them. And that's not the standard. Feel free to provide an argument and share your faith. And if somebody poses a difficult question that you haven't thought of, that's not a problem at all. You just say, oh, that's very interesting. Let me look into that and I'll get back to you next time. And maybe leave them with a question for them to think about, and they can come back to you. So then you can go and research it, talk to an expert, think about it, and then come back to them. As somebody who's thought about a lot of those things, there's always a great answer, even if on the spot you didn't, many times I've heard somebody say something, an atheist say something, and at the very first instant, I think, oh, well, that's really good. And then I think about it a little longer and, oh, it's like, no, that's a horrible argument, but it just doesn't come to you in the moment. And that's okay. Yeah, you don't have to have all the answers on the spot. So feel free to, share your faith and present maybe the one argument that come back to you and say, well, what about this? If you've never heard that counter argument before, say, well, let me get back to you about that. And next time you go back and you tell them that, maybe they say something else. And you say, well, I've never thought about it. I'll get back to you. It's not a sign of weakness to do that. Much worse is to try to make up something on the spot that's really bad, and then you dig yourself into a hole. So I'd say the biggest mistake Christians make is thinking that they have to have all the answers.
I just would like my podcast listeners to know of one highlight from my perspective that was completely impressive about your resume that I did not highlight earlier in the podcast open. And that is that you've climbed successfully summited some of the highest mountains in the United States, but you've climbed the world's highest volcano in South America. And I had to look this up, and I found that this is 22,000 feet. In the multi-dimensional element of your resume, where you cover a lot of different territories from law to theology, now I see evidence where you've done something physically impressive. Tell us the story about your experience climbing that volcano and why you picked that particular target to summit.
To challenge myself. The funny thing about that is technically on that day, I didn't know this going into it. So that's the second highest peak in South America, second to Aconcagua. And on that day, we checked, Aconcagua had really bad weather. So nobody summited Aconcagua that day. And it's also the off season for, Everest and K2 and all those bigger mountains. So on that day, I was actually physically the highest person on Earth for that little moment on that day, which obviously doesn't really mean anything, but it was kind of neat. It's kind of a neat feeling to be up there, and there's 7 billion people on the Earth or something, and for that moment in time, I was the highest one. I don't know. Hopefully, I wasn't thinking I was like looking down on people metaphorically, but it was just kind of a weird feeling. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, very, very challenging. But yeah, it was fun to kind of prepare for, I guess, to make it similar to a courtroom or a debate about God. If you put in the work and you do all the preparation and you prepare for contingencies and what might go wrong, things tend to work out well if you put in all the preparation there.
Professor Michael Conklin, professor of business law at Texas A&M University. We absolutely, may God continue to bless your career and your ministry. The very best to you and your family. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining our podcast today. As we grow our channel, it helps if you subscribe and hit the like button below. We have a number of amazing guests in the days ahead, so continue to monitor our channel for new content. One note to wrap up our discussion for today. Keep in mind that Jesus said the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. So while there was every expectation that we would be under spiritual attack, evil does not win, and the church of the living God will never be defeated. The question is, what side of the battle will you be on? Our prayers for you and your family in these dark days ahead. Just remember, while culture will attack you and label you with all sorts of hatred, as the writer of Romans states, if God is for us, who could possibly be against us? Thanks for joining today.